Academic literature on Stalin and Stalinism abounds. There is absolutely no way we can discuss any of it in detail here. But it is possible to chart the main tendencies and trends within this historiography. We can also identify historians' main approaches to the phenomena of Stalinism. We can also speak about the reasons for the predominance of this or that tendency or trend at different times. Obviously, no serious research into Stalinism could be done by Soviet historians until the late 20th century. The relevant archives were closed until the 1990s, and all historical writing, as indeed any other writing in the USSR, was strictly censored. During Stalin's life, whatever was written about him in the Soviet Union could only be hagiographical. Even long after his death, Soviet ideologists and censors defined exactly what could be written about Stalin and what couldn't. For example, collectivization and industrialization could only be described as the greatest socialist achievements of the Stalin era. Excesses during collectivization and industrialization could only be presented within the parameters of Stalin's own article, Dizzy with Success. The scale of opposition to collectivization, or the scale of the famine that followed, was never mentioned. In the West, the first to write about Stalin and Stalinism were communists. Maurice Dobb was a British economist. He was a communist, and he wrote about the USSR, about Soviet economy, Soviet economic development, as you can see, from the 1920s until 1940s. And all the time, every next book glorified the mode of Soviet economy. Dobb collected masses of data, but there were no unpleasant realities in his books. For example, he never ever mentioned prison labor. British socialists Sidney and Beatrice Webb, they were very famous intellectuals, creators of the London School of Economics, for example. They traveled to the Soviet Union very often, many times. They had friends among the Soviet elite, and these friends visited them. They believed every word that they were told. When these friends disappeared in Stalin's Gulag, their comment was, well, there was something bourgeois in their behavior. The Webbs published several books. The most famous of them were The Soviet Communism, A New Civilization. This book was published for the first time in 1935, and then the first edition had a question mark in the title, Soviet Communism, A New Civilization. In 1937, right at the height of Stalin's purges, the book appeared, the second edition of the book appeared, and there was no question mark. Soviet Communism, A New Civilization. People who uncritically praised the Soviet regime were often called in the West fellow travelers. Lenin is credited with calling them useful idiots. It's not clear whether he did or not. But it is easy to see the reasons for such the uncritical admiration of Western intelligentsia for the Soviet regime. It was a reaction to the devastation of the First World War, to the Great Depression, and to the Nazi accession to power. They blamed bourgeois democracies for all that, and they strove to find a better society. Socialist Russia, with its slogans and promises, seemed to fill the bill. The first criticism of Stalin and Stalinism also came from the communists, first of all from Leon Trotsky. In exile, Trotsky wrote many books about his main rival. Obviously, the way he presented Stalin was as a person who betrayed Lenin and who betrayed the revolution. Trotsky wrote that the regime that Stalin created had nothing to do with socialism. After the Second World War, the Cold War that started brought about new realities. It was a new era. First of all, the war itself brought the first harvest of Soviet archival and other primary sources to the West. One example, an outstanding example, was the Smolensk archives. The regional archives of Smolensk were captured by the Germans during their quick advance into the Soviet territory, and then it was recaptured by the Americans. So, in the Cold War era, many detailed studies of Stalin's purges, show trials, the Gulag, forced deportations of whole nations, of excesses of collectivization and industrialization, and of the role of prison labor appeared. The person who was most intimately associated with the Cold War era writing on Stalinism was Robert Conquest. He published his major book, The Great Terror, Stalin's Purge of the 30s, in 1968, and it was a bombshell. He described Stalin's methods. He described the methods of the NKVD, and he tried to calculate the number of Stalin's victims. All of this was a revelation to the contemporaries. Conquest wrote many books, practically on all the topics that I have mentioned. But such Cold War time exposés of Stalin's atrocities were challenged. The challenge came mostly from the left, and it came on several grounds. The younger generation of historians came to the field of Soviet studies in the 1970s and 1980s. These younger historians branded the writing of its predecessors as the totalitarian approach. Of course, Conquest was pronounced as the main totalitarianist or Cold Warrior. These younger historians criticized their predecessors for depicting Soviet people as helpless victims of the omnipotent totalitarian regime. They said that thus all the historians turned them into objects, not the subjects of history. Totalitarianists were also blamed for exaggerating the number of Stalin's victims. Conquest counted them in tens of millions, mostly on the basis of demographic data. Younger historians thought that these enormous figures were a figment of imagination of Cold Warriors, and that these Cold Warriors invented them in order to compromise socialism and the Soviet government. This new generation of historians called themselves revisionists. Their idea was that Stalin's era was not only or even mostly about repression. They refused to study Soviet history as political history only, and particularly as political history from the top. They were interested in social history. They wrote about different social strata of Soviet society, of people's responses and initiatives, of culture, education, and other social issues. This new trend enormously enriched Western Soviet studies, but simultaneously it attempted to diminish the significance of Stalin's repression in the Soviet life. Some of the representatives of this trend went as far as presenting Stalin's purges as a spontaneous initiative from below and an administrative response to the demands of the population. The most outstanding representative of the revisionist historiography was Sheila Fitzpatrick. Her contribution was enormous. Her books on education and culture in the Soviet Union in the first decades of the Soviet rule were invaluable. But particularly her book on Stalin's Peasants, made a deep impact on historiography of the USSR. Fitzpatrick's work was a new page in the history and historiography of Stalin's era.